Sometimes the greatest horrors don't live in haunted houses or abandoned asylums. They live right upstairs, in the very house you grew up in. Hidden, forgotten, because someone wanted it that way. This story isn't a movie. It isn't urban legend. It happened in a quiet town in France over a century ago. And when the truth came out, even the police couldn't believe what they were seeing. May 23, 1901, Poitiers, France. Blanche Monnier had once been the talk of the town. In her youth, she was radiant, a symbol of French beauty and elegance in Poitiers. With long chestnut hair, graceful posture, and a keen mind, Blanche captured attention everywhere she went. Her family, the Monniers, were prominent, well-respected aristocrats. Her mother, Louise Monnier, was known for her strict social beliefs. Her brother Marcel studied law. They were seen as the perfect bourgeois household. But Blanche was never seen again after the age of 25. The town whispered, of course. Rumors circled. Had she run away, married a poor man and been disowned? Or worse, had something happened to her? But in time, people forgot. As decades passed, Blanche's name faded from memory, her story replaced by others. Her mother and brother went on with their lives, attending dinner parties, organizing charity events, and strolling the streets of Poitiers with dignity and grace. Then, out of nowhere, a letter arrived at the police station. Written anonymously, the paper was yellowed and stained, but the words were unmistakable. I am writing to inform you of a serious situation. A spinster is locked up in Madame Monnier's house. She has been half-starved and lives in filth for the past 25 years, in a room covered in waste. The police hesitated. The Monnier family was influential, and the letter seemed too outlandish. But eventually, curiosity and a shred of suspicion drove officers to investigate. On May 23, 1901, police knocked on the Monniers' door. Louise greeted them politely, poised and proper as always. Marcel sat reading a legal journal in the drawing room. When asked about Blanche, their faces tightened. A moment too long. But they couldn't refuse a search. What the officers found in the upstairs bedroom would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, suffocating chamber. Shutters had been nailed shut. There was no electricity, no warmth, and no air circulation. The smell hit first, a revolting blend of human waste, rot, and mildew. The windows had not been opened in decades. And there, in the farthest corner, lay a form that barely resembled a human being. Blanche Monnier was alive, naked, covered in sores and filth, weighing barely 55 pounds. Her once beautiful hair had matted into dirty ropes. Her eyes were hollow, sunken from malnutrition and darkness. And yet, she was alive. She shielded her face from the light, shrieking like a wounded animal, as if it were the first time she'd seen sunlight in decades. She hadn't spoken to another person outside her family in 25 years. She'd been fed table scraps, bathed rarely, if ever. The floor beneath her mattress was soaked in her own waste. Rats and lice crawled freely. She wasn't chained. She didn't need to be. Her mind had become the prison. Police were horrified. They immediately arrested Louise Monnier and took Blanche to the hospital. She was delirious, malnourished, and suffering from what doctors called psychological wasting. She muttered fragments of prayers and begged for forgiveness, though no one knew what for. What kind of mother could do this? News exploded across France. The La Séquestrée de Poitiers, the sequestered woman of Poitiers, became front-page scandal. Reporters flocked to the Monnier house. Crowds gathered in the streets. How had no one known? How had the neighbors never heard her? How had society let this happen? Blanche's story would only get darker from here. Her brother claimed innocence. Her mother blamed mental illness. And as Blanche slowly regained strength in the hospital, pieces of a deeper horror began to emerge.
March 14, 1882, Poitiers, France.
house looked the same on the outside. White shutters sealed tight, ivy crawling up its stone walls like a hand trying to choke the house itself. The neighbors walked past it daily, never suspecting that something inhuman was happening just a few feet away. Inside that upper floor bedroom, Blanche Monnier hadn't seen sunlight in over 3 years. She didn't mark time by days anymore, only by the sound of footsteps outside her door. Her meals were irregular, sometimes stale bread, sometimes nothing. Water came in a chipped porcelain cup left on the floor. She no longer asked why. She had stopped crying months ago. There was no point. The silence was too thick. The walls didn't care. In her early years of captivity, Blanche resisted. She screamed. She begged. She tore her fingernails against the window shutters, trying to pry them open. But her mother had planned it all. The room was reinforced, locked from the outside. Curtains nailed down. Even if she broke a window, which she tried once, there were iron bars behind it. Eventually, Blanche's voice began to change. It grew hoarse, then weak, then silent. She stopped speaking, not because she couldn't, but because she knew no one was listening. Her body began to change too. The lack of sunlight warped her bones. She became fragile, thinner than anyone should be. Her muscles ached, not from overuse, but from stillness. Her hair started falling out in clumps. Her teeth loosened. Her skin grew pale, almost translucent, with strange sores spreading across her back and arms. At first, Blanche spoke to herself, reciting poetry, remembering her lover's voice, praying. But even those habits began to erode. She started hearing things, a ticking clock that wasn't there, footsteps that never came. She began believing the room was alive, that it breathed, that it listened. Sometimes she would laugh, not because something was funny, but because the silence was unbearable. The mind, when trapped in isolation long enough, creates company. She spoke to cracks in the wall. She believed one of them had a name, Henriette. She told Henriette about her dreams, about her garden, about the man she once loved. And she told Henriette that she wasn't afraid to die anymore, only afraid that no one would remember her. Madame Monnier continued with her life. To the world, she was a dignified widow, an activist for morality, a woman who attended church and hosted intellectual salons. She would walk to the market every Thursday with her head high, exchanging pleasantries with neighbors who admired her for her refined composure. She never once showed a sign of guilt. And her son Marcel, educated, logical, deeply attached to his mother, said nothing. He lived in the house. He heard the muffled sounds from upstairs, but he chose silence, whether out of fear, brainwashing, or cruelty. No one knows. By 1890, Blanche had been locked inside for over 10 years. She was 35 now. Her beauty, once the pride of her family, had vanished. The townspeople assumed she had died long ago. Her name was barely spoken anymore. And yet, every night, she waited. Eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, believing that one day someone would come for her. Even when her body gave up, her hope didn't. February 3rd, 1900. Poitiers Blanche had now been in that room for 24 years. Her mother had grown old but not frail. Her son Marcel had taken over much of the house management. Money was no problem, and they had friends in politics, friends who turned a blind eye when questions about Blanche's past surfaced. But change was coming. A former maid had once told her daughter something strange about the upstairs room. That child, now a woman herself, remembered. And in early 1901, someone, to this day no one knows who, wrote an anonymous letter to French authorities. The letter said, "There is a woman being held against her will in the Monnier residence. She is in terrible condition. Her name is Blanche." That letter changed everything. May 21st, 1901, Poitiers, France. The letter had reached the Ministry of the Interior in Paris, but it didn't take long to route it back to the local authorities in Poitiers. At first, the police didn't take it seriously. The Monnier name carried weight. Madame Monnier was known as a devout and charitable woman. Who would dare accuse her of something so unthinkable? But the letter had detail. It named Blanche. It described the room. It mentioned the odor. By law, they had to act. Quietly, of course. 2 plainclothes officers were dispatched. They knocked on the front door of the Monnier home the next morning. Marcel answered. Calm, courteous. Said his mother was resting. They asked to look around. He hesitated, just for a moment, but long enough to raise suspicion. The moment they stepped inside, one thing was undeniable: the stench. It wasn't the smell of a neglected room. It was the smell of something alive and rotting. One officer asked to inspect the upstairs. Marcel objected, claimed the floorboards were unstable, said no one had used those rooms in decades. They didn't listen. The staircase creaked under their boots as they ascended. The smell intensified. At the end of the hall was a door bolted shut with a steel latch and 3 heavy locks. There was no sound, no movement. The younger officer reached for the latch. Marcel suddenly spoke. "She's very sick. Be careful." It was the first confirmation that someone was in that room. When they didn't light, her skin was ulcered, raw, nearly gray. The walls were covered in filth. Rotting food lay scattered across the floor. A rusted chamber pot sat in the corner, overflowing. The window was boarded shut and nailed down from the outside. The woman looked up, not in recognition, but in terror. She whispered, "Have they come to take me to hell?" The police immediately called for medical aid. It took 4 men to carry Blanche from the room. Not because she was heavy, but because her body was brittle, her bones weak, and her limbs had atrophied. She hadn't walked in years. Outside, the street had filled with curious onlookers. None of them had ever seen Blanche. Many believed she had died decades ago. Now she was alive, but barely. As she was carried out on a stretcher, people gasped. "She looks like a ghost. She's still breathing." Mon Dieu, it was true. The news traveled faster than wildfire. The woman in the cellar. 25 years of captivity. Monnier family scandal rocks France. Parliament members demanded answers. Protesters gathered outside the Monnier estate. Madame Monnier was placed under house arrest that evening. Marcel was detained for questioning. France, and eventually the world, was horrified. What kind of mother could do this to her own daughter? Madame Monnier, once the proud matriarch, sat quietly in her parlor as her name was dragged through every major publication. When she was arrested, she didn't deny anything. She simply said, "She brought shame to the family. I had to protect our name." She died 15 days later in prison, likely from heart failure. Her death was not mourned. People said the devil had come to collect his own. Blanche was taken to a hospital, where doctors struggled to treat her. She couldn't tolerate food. She had rickets, scoliosis, dementia. Her mental state was fragile. She would whisper at night, thinking she was still in the room. Sometimes she screamed when a door closed too loudly. But over time, there were flickers of peace. A nurse said she smiled once while looking at the sky. She said the clouds looked like lilies, the nurse recalled. It was the first time she'd seen clouds in 25 years. June 12, 1901, Poitiers, France. 3 weeks after Blanche was rescued, the Monnier estate stood abandoned, its windows shuttered, its doors locked under police seal. Yet in the hearts of the townspeople, that house still pulsed with horror. Journalists called it the House of Shadows, and while Madame Monnier was already in the ground, justice wasn't finished with her family. The focus now turned to Marcel Monnier, the one man who had every opportunity to stop the nightmare. And didn't. Marcel stood trial in mid-June. His once revered status as a law school professor crushed beneath public outrage. He admitted he knew Blanche was in the room. He admitted he brought her food, water, and occasionally helped clean the waste. But he claimed it wasn't imprisonment. It was protective confinement. He said she was emotionally unstable, and their mother only did what was necessary. The courtroom fell silent as Blanche's doctor took the stand. She wasn't unstable, he said. She was tortured. The court found Marcel Monnier guilty of unlawful detention and complicity in abuse. His sentence 15 months in prison. The people were outraged. 15 months for 25 years? He's free before she can walk again. But Marcel never served his time. On appeal, the court overturned his conviction, citing lack of legal obligation to protect his sister. He walked away a free man. And France wept for Blanche all over again. Blanche remained hospitalized for the rest of her life. Doctors found that she couldn't tolerate sudden noises, bright light, or even basic touch. She flinched at kindness, distrusted voices, and sometimes mistook orderlies for ghosts. The decades of darkness had altered her brain, permanently. Still, she had moments. She once asked for cheese. She giggled at a puppy in the ward. She even remembered poetry she loved in childhood. But every time she looked at a locked door, her eyes went blank again. Blanche lived another 12 years after her rescue. She never recovered fully, mentally or physically, but she found a rhythm. Nurses read to her. Some took her on walks around the garden. Others just sat in silence beside her. She died on October 13, 1913, quietly in her sleep. She was 64, the last thing she saw before closing her eyes was the sky. There was no funeral for Blanche Monnier. No one from her family claimed the body. Instead, a few nurses and townsfolk arranged a burial under a plain headstone in a small cemetery on the edge of Poitiers. It read, Blanche M., finally free. Some say her grave is visited by women who've suffered. Some say her story changed the laws in France about psychiatric imprisonment. Some say her spirit never left that darkened room, not because she's trapped, but because she still watches the world to make sure it never forgets. October 15, 1913. 2 days after Blanche's death. They say the sky over Poitiers looked strange that morning. Not stormy, not gray, just still, almost like the town itself held its breath. As if the story it buried for decades had finally taken its last breath too. Blanche Monnier was gone, and yet she had never really left. Why it still haunts us. There are horror stories that live in fiction. Then there are stories like Blanche Monnier's, stories that tear reality wide open. It's terrifying not because of monsters, but because of how human it all was. A mother turned jailer, a brother turned bystander, a town that looked away. For 25 years, a woman wasted away just feet from freedom, while life bloomed outside her sealed window. Blanche wasn't just imprisoned physically. She was mentally undone, emotionally erased, spiritually extinguished. Slowly, each passing year was a layer of her identity being peeled away, until she was no longer Blanche, but a ghost of longing and loss. Imagine knowing the sun exists, but not seeing it for 9,000 days. After her rescue, the townspeople wrestled with a painful question. How did no one notice? The shutters were always closed. The Monniers were always odd. There were rumors, yes. But fear and class pride kept mouths shut. People didn't question aristocrats. In their silence, they helped build Blanche's cage. Blanche Monnier was born in 1849, a girl full of laughter, light, and longing. She died in 1913, a woman who survived more darkness than most of us could imagine. Her life is more than a horror story. It's a warning, not just about the monsters we fear, but the humans we trust, the rooms we ignore, the doors we don't knock on. This story haunted you. Let it stay with you. Comment below. What would you have done if you lived on Blanche's street? Like if you believe stories like this should never be forgotten. Subscribe for more real-life horror, where silence is the real killer.